Section 18 of the American Rivals of Sherlock Holmes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary in Arkansas. The American Rivals of Sherlock Holmes. The Adventures of the Infallible Godahl by Frederick Irving Anderson. Part 1. Anderson Oliver Armiston was never much of a sportsman with a rod or gun, though he could do fancy work with a pistol in a shooting gallery. He had, however, one game from which he derived the utmost satisfaction. Whenever he went traveling, which was often, he invariably caught his trains by the tip of the tail, so to speak, and hung on till he could climb aboard. In other words, he believed in close connections. He had a theory that more valuable dollars and cents time and good animal heat are wasted warming seats in stations waiting for trains than by missing them. The sum of joy to his methodical mind was to halt the slamming gates at the last fraction of the second with majestic upraised hand, and to stroll aboard his parlor car with studied deliberation, while the train crew were gnashing their teeth in rage and swearing to get even with the gateman for letting him through. Yet Mr. Armiston never missed a train. A good many of them tried to miss him, but none ever succeeded. He reckoned time and distance so nicely that it really seemed as if his trains had nothing else so important as waiting until Mr. Oliver Armiston got aboard. On this particular June day he was due in New Haven at 2. If he failed to get there at 2 o'clock, he could very easily arrive at 3. But an hour is 60 minutes, and a minute is 60 seconds. And further, Mr. Armiston, having passed his word that he would be there at 2 o'clock, surely would be. On this particular day, by the time Armiston finally got to the Grand Central, the train looked like an odds-on favorite. In the first place, he was still in his bed at an hour when another and less experienced traveler would have been watching the clock in the station waiting room. In the second place, after kissing his wife in that absent-minded manner characteristic of true love, he became tangled in a Broadway traffic rush at the first corner. Scarcely was he extricated from this when he ran into a socialist mass meeting at Union Square. It was due only to the wits of his chauffeur that the taxicab was extricated with very little damage to the surrounding human scenery. But our man of method did not fret. Instead, he buried himself in his book, a treatise on cause and effect, which at that moment was lulling him with this soothing sentiment. There is no such thing as accident. The so-called accidents of everyday life are due to the preordained action of correlated causes, which is inevitable and over which man has no control. This was comforting, but not much to the point, when Oliver Armiston looked up and discovered he had reached 23rd Street and had come to a halt. A 60-foot truck, with an underslung burden consisting of a 60-ton steel girder, had at this point suddenly developed weakness on its off hind wheel and settled down on the pavement across the right-of-way like a tired elephant. This, of course, was not an accident. It was due to a weakness in the construction of that wheel, a weakness that had from the beginning been destined to block street cars and taxicabs at this particular spot at this particular hour. Mr. Armiston dismounted and walked a block. Here he hailed a second taxicab, and soon was spinning north again at a fair speed, albeit the extensive building operations in Fourth Avenue had made the street well nigh impassable. The roughness of the pavement merely shook up his digestive apparatus and gave it zest for the fine luncheon he was promising himself the minute he stepped aboard his train. His new chauffeur got lost 3 times in the maze of traffic about the Grand Central Station. This, however, was only human, seeing that the railroad company changed the map on 42nd Street every 24 hours during the course of the building of its new terminal. Mr. Armiston at length stepped from his taxicab, gave his grip to a porter, and paid the driver from a huge roll of bills. This same roll was no sooner transferred back to his pocket than a nimble-fingered pickpocket removed it. This, again, was not an accident. That pickpocket had been waiting there for the last hour for that roll of bills. It was preordained, inevitable, and Oliver Armiston had just 30 seconds to catch his train by the tail and climb aboard. He smiled contentedly to himself. It was not until he called for his ticket that he discovered his loss. For a full precious second he gazed at the hand that came away empty from his money pocket, and then, " I find I left my purse at home," he said, with a grand air he knew how to assume on occasion. " My name is Mr. Oliver Armeston." Now Oliver Armeston was a name to conjure with. " I don t doubt it," said the ticket agent dryly. " Mr. Andrew Carnegie was here yesterday begging car fare to 125th Street, and Mr. John D. Rockefeller quite frequently drops in and leaves his dollar watch in hock. Next !" And the ticket agent glared at the man blocking the impatient line, and told him to move on. Armeston flushed crimson. He glanced at the clock. For once in his life he was about to experience that awful feeling of missing his train. For once in his life he was about to be robbed of that delicious sensation of hypnotizing the gate-keeper and walking majestically down that train platform that extends northward under the train shed a considerable part of the distance toward Yonkers. 20 seconds! Armeston turned round, still holding his ground, and glared concentrated malice at the man next in line. That man was in a hurry. In his hand he held a bundle of bills. For a second the thief instinct that is latent in us all suggested itself to Armeston. There, within reach of his hand, was the money, the precious paltry dollar bills that stood between him and his train. It scared him to discover that he, an upright and honored citizen, was almost in the act of grabbing them like a common pickpocket. Then a truly remarkable thing happened. The man thrust his handful of bills at Armeston. " The only way I can raise this blockade is to bribe you," he said, returning Armeston's glare. " Here, take what you want, and give the rest of us a chance." With the alacrity of a blind beggar miraculously cured by the sight of much money, Armeston grabbed the handful, extracted what he needed for his ticket, and thrust the back into the waiting hand of his unknown benefactor. He caught the gate by a hair. So did his unknown friend. Together they walked down the platform, each matching the other s leisurely pace with his own. They might have been two potentates, so deliberately did they catch this train. Armeston would have liked very much to thank this person, but the other presented so forbidding an exterior that it was hard to find a point of attack. By force of habit Armeston boarded the parlor car, quite forgetting he did not have money for a seat. So did the other. The unknown thrust a bill at the porter. " Get me 2 chairs," he said. " One is for this gentleman." Once inside and settled, Armeston renewed his efforts to thank this strange person. That person took a card from his pocket and handed it to Armeston. " Don't run away with the foolish idea," he said tartly, " that I have done you a service willingly. You were making me miss my train, and I took this means of bribing you to get you out of my way. That is all, sir. At your leisure you may send me your check for the trifle." " A most extraordinary person," said Armeston to himself. " Let me give you my card," he said to the other. " As to the service rendered, you are welcome to your own ideas on that. For my part I am very grateful." The unknown took the proffered card and thrust it in his waistcoat pocket without glancing at it. He swung his chair round and opened a magazine, displaying a pair of broad, unneighborly shoulders. This was rather disconcerting to Armeston, who was accustomed to have his card act as an open sesame. " Damn his impudence," he said to himself. " He takes me for a mendicant. I 11 make copy of him." This was a popular author's way of getting even with those who offended his tender sensibilities. 2 things worried Armeston. One was his luncheon, or rather the absence of it, and the other was his neighbor. This neighbor, now that Armeston had a chance to study him, was a young man well set up. He had a fine bronzed face that was not half so surly as his manner. He was now buried up to his ears in a magazine, oblivious of everything about him, even the dining car porter, who strode down the aisle and announced the first call to lunch in the dining car. " I wonder what the fellow is reading," said Armeston to himself. He peeped over the man's shoulder and was interested at once, for the stranger was reading a copy of a magazine called by the vulgar The Whited Sepulchre. It was the pride of this magazine that no one on earth could read it without the aid of a dictionary. Yet this man seemed to be enthralled. And what was more to the point, and vastly pleasing to Armeston, The man was at that moment engrossed in one of Ormiston's own effusions. It was one of his crime stories that had won him praise and lucre. It concerned the Infallible Godahl. These stories were pure reason incarnate in the person of a scientific thief. The plot was invariably so logical that it seemed more like the output of some machine than of a human mind. Of course the plots were impossible, because the fiction thief had to be an incredible genius to carry out the details, but nevertheless they were highly entertaining, fascinating, and dramatic at one and the same time. And this individual read the story through, without winking an eyelash, as though the mental effort cost him nothing, and then, to Ormiston's delight, turned back to the beginning and read it again. The author threw out his chest and shot his cuffs. It was not often that such unconscious tribute fell to his lot. He took the card of his unknown benefactor. It read, Mr. J. Borden Benson, The Towers, New York City. Humph! Snorted Ormiston. An aristocrat and a snob, too. At this moment the aristocrat turned in his chair and handed the magazine to his companion. All his bad humor was gone. "Are you familiar," he asked, "with this man Ormiston's work? I mean these scientific thief stories that are running now." Yes, oh yes," sputtered Ormiston, hastily putting the other's card away. In fact, you know, I take them every morning before breakfast." In a way this was the truth, for Ormiston always began his day's writing before breakfasting. Mr. Benson smiled, a very fine smile, at once boyish and sophisticated. "Rather a heavy diet early in the morning, I should say," he replied. "Have you read this last one, then?" "Oh, yes," said the delighted author. "What do you think of it?" asked Benson. The author puckered his lips. "It is on par with the others," he said. "Yes," said Benson thoughtfully, "I should say the same thing. And when we have said that, there is nothing left to say. They are truly a remarkable product, quite unique, you know. And yet," he said, frowning at Ormiston, "I believe that this man Ormiston is to be ranked as the most dangerous man in the world to-day." "Oh, I say," began Ormiston, but he checked himself, chuckling. He was very glad Mr. Benson had not looked at his card. "I mean it," said the other decidedly, "and you think so yourself, I fully believe. No thinking man could do otherwise." "In just what way? I must confess I have never thought of his work as anything but pure invention." It was truly delicious. Ormiston would certainly make copy of this person. "I will grant," said Benson, "that there is not a thief in the world to-day clever enough, brainy enough, to take advantage of the suggestions put forth in these stories. But some day there will arise a man to whom they will be as simple as an ordinary blueprint, and he will profit accordingly. This magazine, by printing these stories, is merely furnishing him with his tools, showing him how to work, and the worst of it is—" "Just a minute," said the author, agreeing for the moment that these stories will be the tools of Ormiston's hero in real life some day. "How about the popular magazines? They print 10 such stories to one of these by Ormiston." "Ah, my friend," said Benson, "you forget one thing. The popular magazines deal with real life, the possible, the usual. And in that very thing they protect the public against sharpers by exposing the methods of those same sharpers. But with Ormiston, no, as much as I enjoy him as an intellectual treat, I am afraid." He didn't finish his sentence. Instead, he fell to shaking his head, as though in amazement at the devilish ingenuity of the author under discussion. "I am certainly delighted," thought that author, "that my disagreeable benefactor did not have the good grace to look at my card. This is really most entertaining." And then aloud, and treading on thin ice, "I should be very glad to tell Oliver what you say, and see what he has to say about it." Benson's face broke into a wreath of wrinkles. "Do you know him? Well, I declare! That is a privilege. I heartily wish you would tell him." "Would you like to meet him? I am under obligations to you. I can arrange a little dinner for a few of us." "No," said Benson, shaking his head. "I would rather go on reading him without knowing him. Authors are so disappointing in real life." He may be some puny, anemic little half portion, with dirty fingernails and all the rest that goes with genius. No offense to your friend. Besides, I am afraid I might quarrel with him." "Last call for lunch in the dining car," sang the porter. Ormiston was looking at his fingernails as the porter passed. They were manicured once a day. " Come lunch with me," said Benson heartily. " I should be pleased to have you as my guest. I apologize for being rude to you at the ticket window, but I did want to catch this train mighty bad." Ormiston laughed. " Well, you have paid my car fare," he said, " and I won't deny I am hungry enough to eat a 110-pound rail. I will let you buy me a meal, being penniless." Benson arose, and as he drew out his handkerchief the card Ormiston had given him fluttered into that worthy's lap. Ormiston closed his hand over it, chuckling again. Fate had given him the chance of preserving his incognito with this person as long as he wished. It would be a rare treat to get him ranting again about the author Ormiston. But Ormiston's host did not rant against his favorite author. In fact, he was so enthusiastic over that man's genius that the same quality which he decried as a danger to society, in his opinion, only added luster to the work. Benson asked his guest innumerable questions as to the personal qualities of his ideal, and Ormiston shamefully constructed a truly remarkable person. The other listened entranced. " No, I don't want to know him," he said. " In the first place, I haven't the time, and in the second I'd be sure to start a row. And then there is another thing. If he is half the man I take him to be from what you say, he wouldn't stand for people fawning on him and telling him what a wonder he is. That's about what I should be doing, I'm afraid." " Oh," said Ormiston, " he isn't so bad as that. He is a sensible chap, with clean fingernails and all that, you know, and he gets a haircut once every 3 weeks, the same as the rest of us." " I'm glad to hear you say so, Mr. Benson fell to chuckling. " By gad," he said, " here we've been talking with each other for an hour, and I haven't so much as taken a squint at your card to see who you are." He searched for the card Ormiston had given him. " Call it Brown," said Ormiston, lying gorgeously, and with a feeling of utmost righteousness. " Martin Brown, single, read and write, color white, laced shoes, and derby hat, as the police say." " All right, Mr. Brown. Glad to know you. We will have some cigars. You have no idea how much you interest me, Mr. Brown. How much does Ormiston get for his stories?" " Every word he writes brings him the price of a good cigar. I should say he makes 40,000 a year." " Humph ! That is better than Godahl, his star creation, could bag as a thief, I imagine, let alone the danger of getting snipped with a pistol ball on a venture." Ormiston puffed up his chest and shot his cuffs again. " How does he get his plots?" Ormiston knitted his ponderous brows. " There's the rub," he said. " You can talk about so and so much a word until you are deaf, dumb, and blind. But after all, it isn't the number of words or how they are strung together that makes a story. It is the ideas, and ideas are scarce. I have an idea that I have always wanted Ormiston to get hold of, just to see what he would do with it. If you will pardon me, to my way of thinking the really important thing isn't the ideas, but how do you work out the details." " What's your idea? " asked Ormiston hastily. He was not averse to appropriating anything he encountered in real life and dressing it up to suit his taste. " I'll pass it on to Ormiston, if you say so." " Will you ? That's capital. To begin with," Mr. Benson said as he twirled his brandy glass with long, lean, silky fingers, a hand Ormiston thought he would not have liked to handle him in a rage. " To begin with, Godahl, this thief, is not an ordinary thief. He is a highbrow. He has made some big hauls. He must be a very rich man now, eh? You see that he is quite real to me. By this time, I should say, Godahl has acquired such a fortune that thieving for mere money is no longer an object. What does he do? Sit down and live on his income? Not much. He is a person of refined taste and an eye for the aesthetic. He desires art objects, rare porcelains, a gem of rare cut or color set by Benvenuto Cellini, a Leonardo da Vinci. Did Godahl steal the Mona Lisa, by the way? He's the most likely person I can think of. Or perhaps a Gutenberg Bible. Treasures, things of exquisite beauty to look at, To enjoy in secret, not to show to other people. That is the natural development of this man Godahl, eh? " Splendid !" exclaimed Ormiston, his enthusiasm getting the better of him. " Have you heard of Mrs. Billy Wentworth ?" asked Benson. " Indeed, I know her well," said Ormiston, his guard down. " Then you must surely have seen her white ruby." " White ruby ? I never heard of such a thing. A white ruby ?"" Exactly ; that s just the point. Neither have I. But if Godahl heard of a white ruby, the chances are he would possess it, especially if it were the only one of its kind in the world." " Gad, I do believe he would, from what I know of him." " And especially," went on Benson, " under the circumstances. You know the Wentworths have been round a good deal. They haven t been over scrupulous in getting things they wanted. Now Mrs. Wentworth But before I go on with this weird tale, I want you to understand me. It is pure fiction, an idea for Ormiston and his wonderful Godahl. I am merely suggesting the Wentworths as fictitious characters." " I understand," said Ormiston. " Mrs. Wentworth might very well possess this white ruby. Let us say she stole it from some potentate's household in the Straits Settlement. She gained admittance by means of the official position of her husband. They can't accuse her of theft. All they can do is steal the gem back from her. It is a sacred stone, of course. They always are in fiction stories. And the usual tribe of jugglers, rug peddlers, and so on, all disguised, you understand, have followed her to America, seeking a chance, not on her life, not to commit violence of any kind, but to steal that stone." " She can't wear it," went on Benson. " All she can do is hide it away in some safe place. What is a safe place? Not a bank. Godahl could crack a bank with his little finger. So might these East Indian fellows laboring under the call of religion. Not in a safe. That would be folly." " How, then ?" put in Ormiston, eagerly. " Ah, there you are. That s for Godahl to find out. He knows, let us say, that these foreigners in one way or another have turned Mrs. Wentworth s apartments upside down. They haven t found anything. He knows that she keeps that white ruby in that house. Where is it? Ask Godahl. Do you see the point? Has Godahl ever cracked a nut like that? No. Here he must be the cleverest detective in the world and the cleverest thief at the same time. Before he can begin thieving he must make his blue prints." " When I read Ormiston," continued Benson, " that is the kind of problem that springs up in my mind. I am always trying to think of some knot this wonderful thief would have to employ his best powers to unravel. I think of some weird situation like this. I say to myself, * Good ! I will write that. I will be as famous as Ormiston. I will create another Godahl. But," he said with a wave of his hands, " what is the result? I tie the knot, but I can't untie it. The trouble is, I am not Godahl. And this man Ormiston, as I read him, is Godahl. He must be, or else Godahl could not be made up to do the wonderful things he does. Hello, New Haven already? Mighty sorry to have you go, old chap. Great pleasure. When you get to town let me know. Maybe I will consent to meet Ormiston." Ormiston's first care, on returning to New York, was to remember the providential loan by which he had been able to keep clean his record of never missing a train. He counted out the sum in bills, wrote a polite note, signed it " Martin Brown," and dispatched it by messenger boy to J. Borden Benson, The Towers. The Towers, the address Mr. Benson's card bore, is an ultra fashionable apartment hotel in lower Fifth Avenue. It maintains all the pomp and solemnity of an English ducal castle. Ormiston remembered having on a remote occasion taken dinner there with a friend, and the recollection always gave him a chill. It was like dining among ghosts of kings, so glad and funereal was the air that pervaded everything. Ormiston, who could not forbear curiosity as to his queer benefactor, took occasion to look him up in the Blue Book and the club directory, and found that J. Borden Benson was quite some personage, several lines being devoted to him. This was extremely pleasing. Ormiston had been thinking that white ruby yarn. It appealed to his sense of the dramatic. He would work it up in his best style, and on publication have a fine laugh on Benson by sending him an autographed copy, and thus waking that gentleman up to the fact that it really had been the great Ormiston in person he had befriended and entertained. What a joke it would be on Benson, thought the author, not without an intermixture of personal vanity, for even a genius such as he was not blind to flattery properly applied, and Benson unknowingly had laid it on thick. And by gad, thought the author, I will use the Wentworths as the main characters, as the victims of Godahl. They are just the people to fit into such a romance. Benson put money in my pockets, though he didn't suspect it. Lucky he didn't know what shifts we popular authors are put to for plots. Suiting the action to the words, Ormiston and his wife accepted the next invitation they received from the Wentworths. Mrs. Wentworth, let it be understood, was a lion hunter. She was forever trying to gather about her such celebrities as Ormiston the author, Brackens the painter, Johansen the explorer, and others. Ormiston had always withstood her wiles. He always had some excuse to keep him away from her gorgeous table, where she exhibited her lions to her simpering friends. There were many undesirables sitting at the table, idle rich youths, girls of the fast hunting set, and so on, and they all gravely shook the great author by the hand and told him what a wonderful man he was. As for Mrs. Wentworth, she was too highly elated at her success in roping him for sane speech, as she fluttered about him like a hysterical bridesmaid. But, Ormiston noted with relief, one of his pals was there, Johansen. Over cigars and cognac he managed to buttonhole the explorer. " Johansen," he said, " you have been everywhere." "You are mistaken there," said Johansen. "I've never before to night been north of 59th Street in New York." "Yes, but you have been in Java and Ceylon and the settlements. Tell me, have you ever heard of such a thing as a white ruby?" The explorer narrowed his eyes to a slit and looked queerly at his questioner. " That's a queer question," he said in a low voice, " to ask in this house." Ormiston felt his pulse quicken. " Why? " he asked, assuming an air of surprised innocence. " If you don't know," said the explorer shortly, " I certainly will not enlighten you." " All right, as you please. But you haven't answered my question yet. Have you ever heard of a white ruby?" " I don't mind telling you that I have heard of such a thing. That is, that I have heard there is a ruby in existence that is called the white ruby. It isn't really white, you know. It has a purplish tinge. But the old heathen who rightly owns it likes to call it white, just as he likes to call his blue and gray elephants white." " Who owns it? " asked Ormiston, trying his best to make his voice sound natural. To find in this manner that there was some parallel for the mystical white ruby of which Benson had told him appealed strongly to his superdeveloped dramatic sense. He was now as keen on the scent as a hound. Johansen took to drumming on the tablecloth. He smiled to himself, and his eyes glowed. Then he turned and looked sharply at his questioner. " I suppose," he said, " that all things are grist to a man of your trade. If you are thinking of building a story round a white ruby, I can think of nothing more fascinating. But, Ormiston," he said, suddenly altering his tone and almost whispering, " if you are on the track of the white ruby, let me advise you now to call off your dogs and keep your throat whole. I think I am a brave man. I have shot tigers at 10 paces, held my fire purposely to see how charmed a life I really did bear. I have been charged by mad rhinos and by wounded buffaloes. I walked across a clearing where the air was being punctured with bullets as thick as holes in a mosquito screen. But," he said, laying his hand on Ormiston's arm, " I have never had the nerve to hunt the white ruby." "Capital!" exclaimed the author. "Capital, yes, for a man who earns his bread and gets his excitement by sitting at a typewriter and dreaming about these things. But take my word for it, it isn't capital for a man who gets his excitement by doing this thing. Hands off, my friend." " It really does exist, then?" Johansen puckered his lips. " So they say," he said. " What's it worth?" "Worth? What do you mean by worth? Dollars and cents? What is your child worth to you? A million? A billion? How much? Tell me. No, you can't. Well, that's just what this miserable stone is worth to the man who rightfully owns it. Now let's quit talking nonsense. There's Billy Wentworth shooing the men into the drawing room. I suppose we shall be entertained this evening by some of the $100 a minute song birds as usual. It's amazing what these people will spend for mere vulgar display when there are hundreds of families starving within a mile of this spot. Two famous singers sang that night. Ormiston did not have much opportunity to look over the house. He was fully determined to lay the scene of his story in this very house. At leave taking, the sugar sweet Mrs. Billy Wentworth drew Ormiston aside and said, " It's rather hard on you to ask you to sit through an evening with these people. I will make amends by asking you to come to me some night when we can be by ourselves. Are you interested in rare curios? Yes, we all are. I have some really wonderful things I want you to see. Let us make it next Tuesday, with a little informal dinner, just for ourselves." Ormiston, then and there, made the lion hunter radiantly happy by accepting her invitation to sit at her board as a family friend instead of as a lion. As he put his wife into their automobile, he turned and looked at the house. It stood opposite Central Park. It was a copy of some French chateau in gray sandstone, with a barbican and overhanging towers, and all the rest of it. The windows of the street floor peeped out through deep embrasures, and were heavily guarded with iron lattice work. " Godahl will have the very devil of a time breaking in there," he chuckled to himself. Late that night his wife awakened him to find out why he was tossing about so. " That white ruby has got on my nerves," he said cryptically, and she, thinking he was dreaming, persuaded him to try to sleep again. Great authors must really live in the flesh, at times at least, the lives of their great characters. Otherwise these great characters would not be so real as they are. Here was Ormiston, who had created a Superman in the person of Godahl the thief. For 10 years he had written nothing else. He had laid the life of Godahl out in squares, thought for him, dreamed about him, set him to new tasks, gone through all sorts of queer adventures with him. And this same Godahl had amply repaid him. He had raised the author from the ranks of struggling amateurs to a position among the most highly paid fiction writers in the United States. He had brought him ease and luxury. Ormiston did not need the money any more. The serial rights telling of the exploits of this Godahl had paid him handsomely. The books of Godahl's adventures had paid him even better, and had furnished him yearly with a never-failing income, like government bonds, but at a much higher rate of interest. Even though the crimes this Godahl had committed were all on paper and almost impossible, nevertheless, Godahl was a living being to his creator. More, he was Ormiston, and Ormiston was Godahl. It was not surprising, then, that when Tuesday came Ormiston awaited the hour with feverish impatience. Here, as his strange friend had so thoughtlessly and casually told him, was an opportunity for the great Godahl to outdo even himself. Here was an opportunity for Godahl to be the greatest detective in the world, in the first place, before he could carry out one of his sensational thefts. So it was Godahl, not Ormiston, who helped his wife out of their automobile that evening and mounted the splendid steps of the Wentworth mansion. He cast his eye aloft, took in every inch of the facade. " No," he said, " Godahl cannot break in from the street. I must have a look at the back of the house." He cast his eyes on the ironwork that guarded the deep windows giving on the street. It was not iron after all, but chilled steel sunk into armored concrete. The outposts of this house were as safely guarded as the vault of the United States Mint. " It's got to be from the inside," he said, making mental note of this fact. The butler was stone deaf. This was rather singular. Why should a family of the standing of the Wentworths employ a man as head of their city establishment who was stone deaf? Ormiston looked at the man with curiosity. He was still in middle age. Surely, then, he was not retained because of years of service. No, there was something more than charity behind this. He addressed a casual word to the man as he handed him his hat and cane. His back was turned, and the man did not reply. Ormiston turned and repeated the sentence in the same tone. The man watched his lips in the bright light of the hall. " A lip reader and a dandy," thought Ormiston, for the butler seemed to catch every word he said. " Fact number 2," said the creator of Godahl the thief. He felt no compunction at thus noting the most intimate details of the Wentworth establishment. An accident had put him on the track of a rare good story, and it was all copy. Besides, he told himself, when he came to write the story he would disguise it in such a way that no one reading it would know it was about the Wentworths. If their establishment happened to possess the requisite setting for a great story, surely there was no reason why he should not take advantage of that fact. The great thief, he made no bones of the fact to himself that he had come here to help Godahl, accepted the flattering greeting of his hostess with a grand air that so well fitted him. Ormiston was tall and thin, with slender fingers and a touch of gray in his wavy hair for all his youthful years, and he knew how to wear his clothes. Mrs. Wentworth was proud of him as a social ornament, even aside from his glittering fame as an author. And Mrs. Ormiston was well born, so there was no jar in their being received in the best house of the town. The dinner was truly delightful. Here Ormiston saw, or thought he saw, one of the reasons for the deaf butler. The hostess had him so trained that she was able to catch her servant's eye and instruct him in this or that trifle by merely moving her lips. It was almost uncanny, thought the author, this silent conversation the deaf man and his mistress were able to carry on unnoticed by the others. " By gad, it's wonderful, Godahl, my friend. Underscore that note of yours, referring to the deaf butler. Don't miss it. It will take a trick." Ormiston gave his undivided attention to his hostess as soon as he found Wentworth entertaining Mrs. Ormiston and thus properly dividing the party. He persuaded her to talk by a cleverly pointed question here and there, and as she talked he studied her. " We are going to rob you of your precious white ruby, my friend," he thought humorously to himself. " And while we are laying our wires, there is nothing about you too small to be worthy of our attention." Did she really possess the white ruby? Did this man Benson know anything about the white ruby? And what was the meaning of the strange actions of his friend Johansen when approached on the subject in this house? His hostess came to have a wonderful fascination for him. He pictured this beautiful creature so avid in her lust for rare gems that she actually did penetrate the establishment of some heathen potentate in the Straits simply for the purpose of stealing the mystic stone. " Have you ever, by any chance, been in the Straits?" he asked indifferently. " Wait," Mrs. Wentworth said with a laugh, as she touched his hand lightly. " I have some curios from the Straits, and I will venture to say you have never seen their like." End of Section 18 of The American Rivals of Sherlock Holmes. End of Part 1 of The Infallible Godahl by Frederick Irving Anderson.